My question would be, were you interested in preserving her life at all? Okay, we know there's blood on the porch. We know the door is propped open. We know that she separated from her pacemaker at approximately 2:28 in the morning. The offender or offenders did not choose to take Nancy's health-related items that she would have needed to have survived.
The night of January 31st, 2026 began the way most nights did in the Catalina foothills, quiet, unhurried, settled. Nancy Guthrie had spent the evening the way she often did, in the company of people she loved. Her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso had her over for dinner. There was nothing unusual about the gathering. No tension. No warnings. No reason to think it would be the last time anyone who cared about her would see her well and whole. At approximately 9:50 in the evening, Tommaso drove Nancy home to her residence in the Catalina foothills, just outside Tucson. He was the last known person to have seen her. She went inside. He drove away. That was the last confirmed moment of normalcy in this case. Nancy Ellen Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in the Tucson area for more than 5 decades, having put down roots there in the early 1970s. She had been married to Charles Guthrie until his passing at age 49 during a mining exploration trip in Mexico in 1988. She raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, largely on her own after that. She built a life defined by community, church, routine, and independence. By every account available, she was not a woman who invited chaos. She was organized. She was consistent. She had a scheduled live stream of a church service the following morning, and her family expected her to be there. That is who Nancy Guthrie was, the kind of person whose absence from a church live stream would set off alarms, because she simply did not miss things like that without explanation.
63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her home in her pajamas without the crucial medication that she needs. One source is now sounding the alarm on the investigators' lack of experience, that shortfall possibly having a negative impact in the early but most critical moments of the investigation. In fact, the supervisor who first arrived to Nancy Guthrie's home apparently had never investigated a homicide before.
Her home sat in one of Tucson's more private residential areas. Towering saguaro cacti and long, winding driveways shield nearly every house in the affluent neighborhood north of Tucson. It is the kind of place people choose specifically because it feels removed, safe, protected by distance and by the quiet that comes with it. Nancy had lived there long enough that she knew her neighbors and her neighbors knew her. She was part of the rhythm of that community, the kind of presence that, when it goes missing, leaves a visible gap. Authorities would later say that Guthrie was likely targeted before she was taken from her residence. That detail matters. It means whoever came for her that night did not arrive by accident. They were not passing through. They had already made a decision about her before they ever approached her door. But on the night of January 31st, none of that was visible yet. What was visible, or rather, what would become visible once investigators began pulling the timeline apart, was a sequence of events that did not add up. The following morning, a member of her church contacted the family to report that she had not appeared for her scheduled live stream as expected. Relatives drove to the house around 11 in the morning, searched the property, and found nothing. No Nancy. No indication of where she had gone. Around noon, the family called 911 and reported her missing to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Deputies arriving at the residence noted that her personal belongings, including her phone and other essential items, were still inside the home. Think about what that means for a moment. An 84-year-old woman, who depended on routine, who had a church service scheduled for that morning, left her home without her phone, without her essential items, in the middle of the night, and no one heard a thing. Hi viewers, when you heard that detail, what was the first thing that went through your mind? Drop it in the comments. Sometimes the most important questions in a case come from people paying close attention.
Nobody's eliminated, but we just really don't have enough to say, this is our suspect, this is our guy, we know, or our gal. We just don't know that. And it's really kind of reckless to report that someone is a suspect when they could very well be a victim.
Evidence recovered at the residence indicated that Guthrie had been taken against her will. Pima County Sheriff Chris Neno stated that he believed she had been abducted. A multi-agency response was set into motion. The FBI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Pima County Sheriff's Department, and search and rescue teams all moving in on a neighborhood that had, until that morning, considered itself far removed from anything like this. Images of blood found on Nancy Guthrie's front porch showed the drops appeared to have been smeared. A retired FBI profiler who analyzed the footage frame by frame concluded that at that moment, Nancy's face was very close to the ground, within a foot. She was either on her knees, hunched over, or lying on the ground. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. She was alone. From the chilling moments captured on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera to the technical forensic complications stalling the FBI's progress, investigators were piecing together a mystery that grew more layered the deeper they went. And the deeper they went, the clearer one thing became: this was not random. A former FBI assistant director would later say, this was probably something hatched locally by someone who thought, here's an individual who is relatively defenseless, lives alone, is vulnerable, unable to put up a lot of resistance. Someone had watched her. Someone had planned this. Someone who understood her routine well enough to know exactly when to act. The question investigators could not yet answer was not whether this was deliberate. That much was already clear. The question was how far back the planning went, and how close to home the answer actually was. As of April 24, 2026, law enforcement has stated that Nancy Guthrie's condition and whereabouts remain unknown. She has been gone for nearly 3 months. And somewhere in the details of that quiet January night, the truth is still waiting to be found. If this case has stayed with you the way it has stayed with so many people across this country, subscribe and turn on notifications.
Said, no one's been cleared. Everyone's a suspect. So it is not inappropriate to start where all law enforcement starts, which is with the family, and work out. That's what you're doing. You would be doing that even if your law enforcement source had not said that the brother-in-law may be the prime suspect.
Because more stories like this one, stories that matter, stories that demand attention, are coming to this channel. Share your thoughts below and help keep this conversation going. Nancy Guthrie's family is still looking for answers. Someone out there knows something. And sometimes, awareness is what breaks a case open. At 9:50 in the evening, Tommaso Sioni watched Nancy Guthrie walk through her front door. Then he left. That moment, those few seconds, became the fixed point around which this entire investigation would turn. Because everything that happened after that is either documented, disputed, or still unknown. And the gap between what the evidence shows and what common sense expects is exactly where this case lives. Guthrie did not arrive for a scheduled live stream of a church service the following morning. A member of her church contacted the family to report she had not appeared as expected. That was the first signal. Not an alarm, not a confrontation, just an absence. The kind that, in an older person's life, can mean anything from a nap to something far more serious. Relatives went to her home around 11 in the morning, searched the house and surrounding property, and found no sign of her. No note. No message. No sign of where she had gone or why. What they did find, once law enforcement arrived and the scene was properly examined, told a story that no one in that family was prepared to hear. Blood was found on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. Not a trace amount. Not something that could be explained away as an accident. Investigators and forensic experts who later reviewed the evidence concluded that the pattern of those drops indicated she had been very close to the ground when they fell. A retired FBI profiler analyzed the scene frame by frame and determined that medium-velocity blood spatter can be created when someone aspirates blood and coughs it up. And that at that moment, Nancy's face was within a foot of the ground. She was 84 years old, alone, in the dark, on her own front porch. The camera that should have captured all of it had gone dark. Investigators pointed to the chilling moments captured on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera as one of the most critical pieces of early evidence in the case. That camera had recorded activity at the residence. But the footage it did and did not capture became one of the central threads investigators pulled throughout the weeks that followed. FBI Director Kash Patel released a surveillance photo on February 10, 2026, showing a potential subject in the investigation of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. That image, taken from surveillance footage in and around the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, showed a figure at or near the property. Law enforcement was careful not to call the individual a confirmed suspect. But the release of that image sent a clear message: they were looking for someone specific. The Pima County Sheriff's Department asked for anyone within a 2-mile radius of Guthrie's home to submit any footage they deemed out of the ordinary from January 1st through February 2nd. That is a full month of footage requested from an entire neighborhood. That is not the behavior of investigators who think this was spontaneous. That is the behavior of investigators who believe the preparation for what happened to Nancy Guthrie began well before the night it happened. Authorities stated that Guthrie was likely targeted before she was taken from her residence. That word, targeted, carries weight. It means someone studied her. It means someone identified her as a person of interest not to law enforcement, but to themselves. It means they assessed her routine, her independence, her vulnerability, and made a calculation. Multiple ransom notes of undetermined origin demanded payment in cryptocurrency, with 2 deadlines that had passed by February 9th. 2 deadlines. Both passed. Several media outlets reported receiving ransom notes in connection with Guthrie's disappearance, and efforts were underway to determine if they were sent by the individuals holding Guthrie. Authorities neither confirmed nor denied the validity of the notes. On February 2nd, KOLD-TV, a CBS affiliate in Tucson, reported that it had received a letter demanding payment for Guthrie's release. Then TMZ received messages. Then other outlets. A former FBI agent noted that whoever was behind the notes wanted the negotiations to be public, and that ransom letters sent to numerous media outlets, including TMZ, suggested the people involved were not operating like serious negotiators. Acting in bad faith was the phrase used. From the beginning. Think about what that means. If the ransom demands were real, why make them public? If they wanted money, why give no proof of life? If this was a transaction, why structure it in a way that ensured law enforcement would be watching every channel of communication from day one? Former agent Steve Moore told News Nation. They would provide no proof of life. They didn't take Nancy's safety into consideration, according to physical evidence at the scene. Everything that they did was in bad faith. That statement did not bring clarity. It brought a deeper kind of concern. Because if the ransom notes were not genuine negotiations, then what were they? Distraction? Misdirection? A way to flood investigators with noise while the actual trail went cold? During the evening of February 10th, a person of interest was detained for questioning following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, about 60 miles south of Tucson. Shortly afterward, the Pima County Sheriff's Department and FBI executed a search warrant on a property and vehicle in the same area. By February 11th, the searches had concluded, and the individual was released without charges. It was determined that the individual was not involved in the disappearance. A dead end. The first of several. On February 13th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department began an operation at a residence 2 miles away from Guthrie's house. 2 people were removed from the residence, and roads surrounding the area were closed to the public for about 4 hours. The details of what was found, or not found, at that location were not made public in full. What was made public was that the investigation continued. That no arrests followed. That Nancy Guthrie was still missing. About 24 Pima County and FBI investigators were still actively working the Guthrie case weeks after the initial evidence release. 24 investigators. Multiple agencies. Surveillance footage reviewed, neighborhoods canvassed, ransom notes analyzed, traffic stops executed, search warrants served. And still, no Nancy. The investigation was moving. The leads were real. But nothing was breaking the way it needed to break. And behind the evidence that existed, the blood on the porch, the camera footage, The DNA, the surveillance images, there was something else building. A question that the timeline of that night had quietly placed at the center of everything. The last person to see Nancy Guthrie alive knew exactly where she lived. Knew her routine. Knew her home. Knew which night would work. The investigation was about to get much more specific about what it was actually looking for. In the first days after Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the public narrative was shaped largely by what law enforcement chose to release, and what they chose not to. What they released: surveillance images, a request for neighborhood footage, confirmation of a possible abduction, and the fact that multiple ransom notes had been sent to media outlets demanding cryptocurrency. What they did not release.
Yeah, real early on.
Three, okay, who's an impeccable source, told you that Tommaso Cioni, who is married to Annie Guthrie, Savannah's sister, may be the prime suspect in this case,
At this time,
and that the car that was towed and impounded was Annie Guthrie's car.
Yeah.
Specifics about the DNA found at the scene, the full contents of the camera footage, the identity of any persons of interest, and the details of what exactly happened between 9:50 in the evening and the moment someone reported her missing. That space, between what was known and what was being withheld, is where public attention focused. And it is also where investigators were doing their most careful work. The Pima County Sheriff's Department described the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home as a sample that came from more than one person and therefore needed to be untangled. A mixed sample. That is a significant forensic challenge. It means the DNA found at the scene did not belong to a single individual. It was layered, combined, requiring separation before any meaningful identification could be attempted. Sheriff Chris Nanos told a neighborhood watch group that it could take 6 months to separate the strands and isolate what investigators need. He also said as many as 5 labs around the country were working on the Guthrie case. 5 labs. 6 months. That is the scale of the forensic effort this case required. Not because the evidence was thin, but because the evidence was complex. Mixed DNA does not mean useless DNA. It means the process of reading it accurately takes time, precision, and technology that not every lab has access to. Fox News reported that a San Francisco forensics lab that helped crack a high-profile serial killer case on Long Island, New York, was believed to be involved in the Guthrie case. That is not a routine referral. That kind of specialized lab involvement signals that investigators believed the DNA evidence held answers. And that they were willing to pursue those
63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her home in her pajamas without the crucial medication that she needs. One source is now sounding the alarm on the investigators' lack of experience, that shortfall possibly having a negative impact in the early but most critical moments of the investigation. In fact, the supervisor who first arrived to Nancy Guthrie's home apparently had never investigated a homicide before.
That phrasing matters in a case like this, because it suggests the standard methods had already been tried. Previous DNA samples either did not get a hit in CODIS, the FBI's national database for DNA from criminal offenders, or were mixed with that of another individual. No match in CODIS. That tells investigators one of a limited number of things. Either the person responsible has no prior criminal record, or they have a record but their DNA was never collected, or the sample itself was too degraded or mixed to return a clean result. None of those options narrow the field quickly. All of them require more time. Meanwhile, the surveillance footage was producing its own complications. On February 18th, Google announced it was trying to extract additional footage from the various home cameras. The fact that Google, not just local law enforcement, not just the FBI, but the technology company that manufactures the camera system, was brought in to recover footage tells you something important. The footage either existed in fragments, had been partially deleted, or required technical recovery beyond what standard investigative tools could provide. Someone had interacted with that camera system. The question was how, when, and from where. Behavioral patterns in cases like this one often tell investigators as much as physical evidence does. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated that in the vast majority of kidnappings, those responsible had some prior connection to the victim, such as a former employee, a current employee's partner, a family member, or someone who had worked on the property and had access. Access. That word came up repeatedly across multiple law enforcement analyses of this case. Not forced entry. Not a break-in. Access. The kind of access that does not require picking a lock or breaking a window, because the person already knows how the property works. Miller described the perpetrator as likely someone local who had enough contact around the house to assess what being inside would be like, and had constructed a plan around demanding ransom through cryptocurrency, deliberately avoiding any physical ransom drop or pickup that would expose them in person. That is a specific kind of planning. It is the planning of someone who understood that the traditional vulnerabilities in a kidnapping for ransom, the exchange, the handoff, the moment when the person demanding money has to physically show up somewhere, were the moments most likely to result in arrest. So they designed around those moments. They tried to make the entire transaction digital, anonymous, and remote. A former FBI agent observed that whoever sent the ransom notes wanted the negotiations to be public, and that the notes were sent to numerous media outlets including TMZ. That decision, to go wide, to make noise, to pull media attention in, could be read two ways. Either the people responsible were poorly organized and did not understand how these situations typically conclude, or the public ransom notes were never meant to succeed as a transaction. They were meant to occupy attention while something else happened entirely. Investigators were not ruling anything out. As time passed and progress slowed, scrutiny began to grow around the leadership of the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Reports highlighted questions about Sheriff Chris Nano's past employment and departmental practices, prompting county officials to request additional information about his background and leadership. Nanos, through his attorney, acknowledged that he had resigned from the El Paso Police Department in 1982 to avoid a suspension, while disputing claims that he misrepresented his disciplinary history. The agency leading the most high-profile missing person case in the country was itself under examination. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to question Sheriff Nanos about his work history and management of the department. That is an extraordinary situation. An active, time-sensitive investigation. A missing 84-year-old woman. A nationally watched case. And the sheriff at the center of it facing a vote of scrutiny from the very county he serves. None of that stopped the investigation. 24 investigators remained on the case. Labs across the country continued working on the DNA. The surveillance footage analysis continued. Tips were still coming in. But the picture had grown more complicated than anyone expected it to be. And the most important details, where Nancy was, who took her, and why, remained out of reach. What investigators did have, though, was a growing understanding of the time before that night. Not just the night of January 31st. The weeks before it. And what that period revealed would shift the entire frame of this investigation. The question investigators kept returning to was not just what happened on the night of January 31st. It was what happened before it. Because if this was targeted, and every piece of evidence pointed toward targeting, then there was a period of observation, assessment, and preparation that preceded the moment Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. And that period left traces. Not enough to make an arrest, but enough to understand the architecture of what was being built. Authorities stated that Guthrie was likely targeted before she was taken from her residence. That conclusion did not come from a single piece of evidence. It came from the accumulation of details that, individually, might each have a reasonable explanation, but together formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. The surveillance images released by law enforcement showed a figure appearing near the Guthrie property on more than one occasion in the weeks before her disappearance. These were not confirmed intrusions. There was no documented forced entry, no break-in during those earlier visits. The figure appeared, observed, and left. The FBI released footage of her alleged abductor at her doorstep. That image, a person standing at the entrance to her home, became one of the most widely circulated images in the case. What investigators noted about the earlier appearances was the absence of action. Someone came close enough to act and did not. That is not the behavior of someone who stumbled across an opportunity. That is the behavior of someone running through a sequence. Checking sightlines, timing movements, confirming what they already believed they knew about how the property functioned and when it was occupied. The Pima County Sheriff's Department asked for any footage from January 1st through February 2nd that residents in a 2-mile radius deemed out of the ordinary or important. A full month. That window was not chosen randomly. Investigators believed the preparation period began in January, possibly earlier, and that footage from that stretch of time could connect the visible evidence to a larger sequence of events. DNA found at the scene included hair samples. Hair left at the location. That kind of physical evidence does not come from a passing glance at a property from the street. It comes from proximity, from presence, from someone who was close enough, long enough, to leave something of themselves behind. The forensic complexity of the sample, mixed, layered, requiring advanced lab work to untangle, suggested more than one person may have been present at the scene at some point. The Pima County Sheriff's Department described the DNA as a sample that came from more than one person and therefore needed to be untangled. That detail had been consistent since early in the investigation, and it raised a question that investigators had been working around carefully. Was this the work of one person, or more than one? Forensic analyst Jim Clementi was adamant that the kidnapping involved only one person, reasoning that if there had been two, one of them would have had complete control of Nancy inside the house and would not have lost that control. One person, operating alone, who had studied the target, understood the property, and constructed a plan that removed as much visible risk as possible, including avoiding the traditional exposure points that come with demanding a ransom in person. Miller described the plan as an attempt to take kidnapping into the digital age, demanding ransom through cryptocurrency, never appearing at a drop location, never making themselves physically visible during any exchange. The cryptocurrency demand was specific. Multiple ransom notes of undetermined origin demanded payment in cryptocurrency, with 2 deadlines that had passed by February 9th. 2 deadlines. Neither met. Neither followed by the proof of life that the Guthrie family and law enforcement had requested. Family appeals on social media had not yielded any proof of life sought from the person or persons who took Nancy Guthrie. That absence, that persistent, deliberate silence from whoever held her, is one of the most troubling threads in this entire case. It suggested either that the people responsible were not genuinely willing to negotiate, or that the situation on their end had changed in ways they were not willing to communicate. A note received by TMZ claimed the sender had seen Nancy in Mexico. Law enforcement did not confirm this claim, but it added a geographic dimension to a case that had, until that point, been focused primarily on Tucson and the surrounding Arizona desert. 60 miles south of Tucson is the Mexican border. The person of interest briefly detained in February had been stopped in Rio Rico, a town sitting directly along that corridor. The search radius was wider than most people realized. The United Cajun Navy offered to assist in the search for Nancy Guthrie, revising a proposal to help cover terrain that law enforcement resources had not yet fully reached. Search teams were still moving. The investigation was still active. But the trail, by every public account, had not produced the single break the case required. The case remains unsolved with few leads, limited physical evidence, a lack of witnesses, and ongoing questions. That assessment, accurate as of late April 2026, reflected not a failure of effort but a failure of luck. Sometimes cases break because of a tip. Sometimes because of a forensic result. Sometimes because someone talks. None of those things had happened yet. But the preparation was visible. The targeting was established. The digital fingerprint, cell data, surveillance footage, DNA, camera interactions, was still being analyzed. And the people doing that analysis had not stopped. As many as 5 labs around the country were working on the Guthrie case. 5 labs. That is a statement of commitment. That is investigators saying, in the language of resource allocation, that they believe the answer is in the evidence, and that they are going to find it. What they were building toward, slowly, carefully, with the kind of methodical patience that serious investigations require, was a complete picture. Not just of what happened that night, but of everything that led to it. The observation period, the preparation, the decision, the execution. And at the center of all of it was a choice that someone made about Nancy Guthrie, a choice that treated her life as a means to an end. That choice had consequences the person who made it had not fully anticipated. Because the investigation was not slowing down. It was consolidating. Nearly 3 months after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills, the case remained open, active, and watched. As of late April 2026, authorities had not publicly named a suspect, and the investigation remained ongoing. That is not a statement about where this case ends. It is a statement about where it stands at this moment. And where it stands is this: everything investigators have built points toward a specific kind of person, a specific kind of plan, and a specific set of circumstances that are still being pieced together one thread at a time. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller stated his belief clearly: "I think the answer is, and I think the Guthrie family believes this too, the answer is right there. The answer is in Tucson. In Tucson. Not across a border. Not in a distant city. In the same community where Nancy had lived for more than 50 years. Among people who knew the neighborhood. Who knew the rhythms of daily life in the Catalina foothills. Who had some kind of contact with the property or the family close enough to make this plan feel achievable." Miller said that in the vast majority of kidnapping cases, those responsible had prior connection to the victim. A former employee, someone who had worked on the property, a family associate, and that he did not believe this case would be vastly different. That framing is significant. It means the investigation is not looking for an unknown figure who arrived from somewhere else. It is looking for someone whose name may already exist in a database, a phone record, a transaction history, a payroll, someone who intersected with Nancy Guthrie's life in a way that left a traceable record. About 24 Pima County and FBI investigators remained actively working the case. Lab work continued across multiple facilities. A San Francisco forensics lab involved in a major prior case was believed to be assisting with the DNA analysis. New technology was being applied to samples that had already gone through standard testing without a result. That is the definition of an investigation that has not accepted its current position as permanent. Savannah Guthrie said her family cannot be at peace without answers. In an interview, she said, "I'm so sorry, Mommy, I'm so sorry." She had told her friend and former co-host Hoda Kotb that she feared her public profile had made her mother a target, that the attention surrounding the Guthrie name had reached someone who saw in it not a reason for respect, but a reason for exploitation. That possibility. That the motive was financial, rooted in the assumption that a family connected to a nationally known television personality would pay whatever was demanded, had been central to the investigation from the beginning. Forensic expert Jim Clementi stated, in order to get that money, he would have to control her, take her, threaten her life. And then, the fact is clearly that actually didn't happen in these circumstances. He was referring to the ransom notes. To the absence of follow-through, the absence of proof of life, the absence of the basic mechanics that a genuine ransom negotiation requires. The notes came. The deadlines passed. The silence continued. A reward of $1.2 million has been offered for details that could help solve the case. The Guthrie family offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. That kind of reward does not go unclaimed in most cases. Someone, somewhere, knows something. Someone saw something. Someone was told something by someone who should not have spoken. Outside Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills, a memorial has grown along the road, dried flowers replaced by fresh ones, neighbors stopping to add to it, residents who barely knew her name standing there because they could not think of anywhere else to be. One Tucson resident who came to pay her respects said, "It is not over. We just keep questioning. Something happened, someone knows something, and we are just praying that someone will come forward and do the right thing." That is where this case rests right now. Not closed. Not resolved. Not forgotten. Nancy Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942. She was married to Charles Guthrie until his death in 1988. She raised 3 children. She had lived in Tucson for more than 50 years. She had a church service scheduled for the morning of February 1st. She had people who expected to see her, who noticed when she was gone, who called for help within hours. She was someone's mother. Someone's neighbor. Someone whose absence left a gap in a community that had known her for half a century. As of April 24, 2026, law enforcement has stated that her condition and whereabouts remain unknown. The investigation continues. The labs are still working. The tips line is still open. The reward is still unclaimed. And the one question that has sat at the center of this case since the morning of February 1st, the question that every piece of evidence, every forensic analysis, every behavioral assessment has been working toward, remains unanswered. Where is Nancy Guthrie? If you want to help, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. Someone out there holds the piece of this that investigators are still looking for. Stories like this one. Stories that matter, stories that ask something of the people watching them, deserve attention, and they deserve community. If this reached you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice in this conversation matters. And if you know someone who should hear about this case, share this with them. Nancy's family has not stopped. Neither should the rest of us.